Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. David had lost his kingdom to his own son, and he had been forced to vacate Jerusalem, depending on a handful of spies to give him updates on conditions in the capital. When the armies of David eventually did battle with those of Absalom, David left word that his son was to be spared. But Joab, David's military commander, ignored David's orders and executed Absalom himself. The coup came to an abrupt end, and David was restored to his throne as the king of Israel. When the good news had finally made its way to David, rather than rejoicing over his good fortune, he went into mourning over the death of his son. Once again, we see David responding in a less-than-satisfactory way to the events surrounding his life. He didn't deal with Joab's insubordination. He didn't take Absalom's death as a sign from God. He simply went into the chamber over the gate and wept. And as usual, his actions would have serious repercussions. David had sent his troops into battle against the superior forces of his son, Absalom, and he had stayed behind. As the day wore on, he could do nothing but wonder what had happened. This was a winner-takes-all battle that would determine whether David would regain his throne, spend his life in exile, or lose his life to his own son. So when Joab and his troops had won a great victory and done away with Absalom, they sent word to David. But Joab knew exactly how David would respond. He had been fully aware of David's command to spare the life of Absalom, but he had disobeyed. He had personally driven 3 spears into the body of David's rebellious son as he helplessly hung from a tree, his long hair caught in its branches. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok the priest, had already been chosen by David to be a courier, bringing him any news taking place within the walls of Jerusalem. So he offered to be the one to inform David of the great victory. But Joab knew that this news was not going to be well received by David. Joab knew David well and had seen how he had treated other messengers who bore bad news. As a result, he sent a Cushite, a foreigner, to tell David of the victory and the death of his son. Yet Ahimaaz was determined to be the one to give David the news, and he outran the Cushite. And when he arrived at David's camp, he only told him of the victory over the Israelites. He pleaded ignorance regarding the physical well-being of Absalom. Perhaps he didn't know what had happened, or he could have lied, desiring to win favor with David by being the first to tell him the good news of the victory. He would let the Cushite be the bearer of bad news, and bad news it was. David's reaction says it all. The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son." 2 Samuel 18, verse 33. David doesn't say a word about the victory. He shows no gratitude to either Ahimaaz or the Cushite for bringing him news that his kingdom had been restored. Even these 2 young men had recognized the hand of God in the day's events. Ahimaaz had announced to David, "Praise to the Lord your God, who has handed over the rebels who dared to stand against my lord the king." 2 Samuel 18, verse 28. The Cushite had responded in a similar way. "I have good news for my lord the king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you." 2 Samuel 18, verse 31. There's a passage in the book of Isaiah that reflects the perspective David should have had when he received the news of God's miraculous deliverance of his kingdom. How beautiful on the mountains are the feet of the messenger who brings good news, the good news of peace and salvation, the news that the God of Israel reigns. Isaiah 52, verse 7. But rather than celebrate the salvation of God, David mourned the loss of his son. He even wished that he had been the one to die that day instead of Absalom. This ingratitude toward God was evident to all those around David. It shocked and surprised them. David was taking the divine deliverance of God and treating it with disdain. It was one thing to mourn and regret the loss of his son, but he had an obligation as the God-appointed king of Israel to lead his people by example. This was not to be a day of mourning, but of celebration. The kingdom needed to be unified. David needed to put aside his personal issues and begin the process of restoring the faith of his people in his ability to lead well. Absalom had undermined David's integrity and had caused the people to reject him as king. Now that he had his throne back, he needed to win back the hearts of the people. But David was too busy mourning, and this would go on for some time. The opening lines of the very next chapter tell us, Word soon reached Joab that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. As all the people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of that day's victory was turned into deep sadness. They crept back into the town that day as though they were ashamed and had deserted in battle. The king covered his face with his hands and kept on crying, "O my son Absalom, O Absalom, my son, my son." 2 Samuel 19, verses 1 through 4. David's demeanor cast a pall over the entire nation. Rather than displaying a spirit of celebration, there was a somberness and seriousness to the people. They were afraid to express joy because their king was despondent and depressed, and David's actions would not have expressed confidence in his troops. They would have naturally been upset that the king had turned their great victory into a national day of mourning. They had risked their lives, and many of their brothers had lost their lives, so that David might be restored to his throne. And all he could do was weep over the death of his rebellious son. The prophet Isaiah goes on to describe how the king and the nation should have responded to the news of the victory over their enemy. The watchmen shout and sing with joy, for before their very eyes they see the Lord returning to Jerusalem. Let the ruins of Jerusalem break into joyful song, for the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has demonstrated his holy power before the eyes of all the nations. All the ends of the earth will see the victory of our God. Isaiah 52, verses 8 through 10. How easy it is for us to view life from our limited perspective and to selfishly place our desires over those of God. David had wanted to spare Absalom and somehow return things back to the way they had been before. But God, in his justice, had determined to punish Absalom for what he had done. He was deserving of death, and had David been able to spare him, Absalom would have proven to be a constant threat to his throne. God did what needed to be done, and he had graciously given David back his kingdom. But rather than gratitude and joy, David returned God's undeserved favor with self-pity and an infectious spirit of sorrow.